Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is an notorious open source intelligent app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
I'm Michael, Intel Officer at Artorias.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer at Artorias. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about the latest developments related to Iran and the war impacting the Middle East. But before we discuss about that, I want to give a quick intelligence updates on the situation in Cuba. Because in Cuba, what we're currently seeing is intensified protests from civilians inside of Cuba against the communist government because of the economic situation that is impacting the island. And more importantly, what we're seeing is that protesters are starting to target communist government institutions and buildings in Cuba because of the economic crisis that's going on. Specifically, in the last couple of days, in Moron, Cuba, we've seen protesters storm and destroy one of the Communist Party's headquarters in the city of Moron. And we also got reports that the Cuban government has already resorted to lethal weapons to try to suppress the protests. This happens within the backdrop of U.S. and Cuban negotiations related to the communist government's ability to maintain stability and security within the island, with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, really pushing for a liberalization of Cuba and the removal of the communist government from the island. I would highly recommend all our listeners to follow SITREP to see the latest developments in Cuba, because this might be a situation where, although there's protests going on right now across Cuba because of the economic crisis that's going on, we might see a situation that rapidly deteriorates and see a change of government or an intensification of protests against the communist government in the island, and how that might change the situation on the ground. I would really want to preface this that inside of Cuba right now, there is a basically black hole of information where it is very difficult to get the information getting out, where we see really what happens. But all the indications we're getting right now is that inside of Cuba, we're seeing an increased level of protests against the communist government. And this is something that is what the Trump administration really wanted to see if the communist government is able to fall because of the oil embargo that happened after the capture of Nicolas Maduro and the prevention of oil being sent over to Cuba that's causing the energy crisis that we're seeing right now. But with that, I wanted to introduce John Lareer, or Defense Bulletin, who is our guest speaker today, who's going to give us an update on the situation inside of Iran and the military conflict that's currently impacting the Middle East. John, you have been a regular host and guest of ours, and I want to introduce you as well. Please, to our speakers and everybody who's listening in, please give us an introduction to who you are, and thank you again so much for joining us for this latest episode of The Bluff.
Yeah, so I'm John Lareer. First off, thanks for having me on here, guys. I'm a writer for Ocean Defender, and I write for Lethal Minds publication bulletin for the Borderlands before, as well as I've written for Alcon Intelligence. So I'm a writer and an analyst that covers not strictly, but my main wheelhouses are the Indo-Pacific theater of competition and the Middle East theater of competition. And obviously, that's the subject at hand here today. Today we're talking about the ongoing U.S., Israel, and Iran conflict that is now expanded to include Gulf nations and a number of European nations as well, and also some nations on the particular Anatolian nation as well, that being Turkey. I think just to start off, I think one thing that's characterized this conflict so far has been kind of standoff munitions. I think we can kind of all agree on that. The conflict was started out with joint U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran. A lot of people assess that Iran may preempt with some preemptive strikes. I think most competent analysts kind of assessed otherwise. But it started out with U.S. joining U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran, and Iran quickly responded with strikes on Israel and U.S. bases and infrastructure throughout the region. Over time, their strike campaign shifted to include oil and gas infrastructure of their Gulf neighbors as well, in order to sort of beggar their ability to get commodities through the Strait of Hormuz. And we've kind of seen what could be called a major majority closer of the Strait of Hormuz as we speak right now, with a combination of the lack of insurance willing to cover that, and then also just the sheer kinetic fact of missiles flying through, flying in the air and stuff. Boats don't want to sail through there, and those who have been hit by missiles, and are also USVs as well. To date, Iran has fired 2,568 drones and 836 ballistic missiles at U.S. bases and infrastructure, and also their Gulf neighbors as well. A few of those hit Turkey as well. I believe we've had at least two separate incidents where a ballistic missile may not have directly been targeting Turkey, but Turkish and/or NATO air defenses were engaged to shoot them down because they were on a trajectory to impact in Turkey. And at least on one occasion, debris did fall within Turkey. Additionally, European partners, US's European partners, and also the European partners of Gulf nations have been somewhat drawn into the war, specifically Great Britain, who is actively employing fighter aircraft over a number of nations, including Cyprus, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait, to shoot down Iranian drones and missiles in purely a defensive role. They have not launched any strikes against Iran as of yet. France has increasingly been getting involved here, especially after one of their soldiers was killed in an Iranian drone strike, a ballistic missile strike, that is. And we've seen as recently as of about an hour ago, French President Emmanuel Macron spoke with his Iranian counterpart and urged him to kind of stop the war. Obviously, it's highly unlikely that much will come of that call. But we increasingly see Macron getting involved here kind of on a unilateral basis here. He's historically done that in the past. There's been since the war has started, the U.S. on the flip side here, the U.S. has struck over 6,000 targets as of yesterday, I believe, struck over 6,000 targets across Iran. Now, the majority of those targets have been kind of sequestered to the western coast here, and we've increasingly seen both U.S. and Israeli strikes creep further eastward as they continue to kind of maintain and expand their air superiority over the nation of Iran here. And I should expect that those strikes will only increase as the president, U.S. President Donald Trump has said. Well, he's actually contradicted himself a couple of times, but so far it does seem that this campaign will be ongoing for a number of weeks. This amidst a number of reports from FT, WSJ, and a number of other news organizations that say that stockpiles of not only interceptors but standoff munitions are dwindling as well. There's been as a result of the 6,000 targets that have been struck across Iran, there's been about a 90 to 95% decrease in Iranian strikes overall. However, that might not necessarily be indicative of degraded capacity, but a degraded ability to effectively marshal both mobile and more fixed systems in the open in order to mass fires at targets throughout the region. At the same time here, there is a disconnect between principal Iranian decision makers and operational forces that we've been continuously hearing about. The president of the foreign minister of Iran openly said this in the first week of the war, that the initial strikes did create that disconnect here, and they were acting on orders that were given to them prior to the conflict, should the conflict happen. And so, as I see it, that's the current state of play that we're currently at right now. I think the only other thing that's hugely important to include as well is that to date, I believe there's been roughly 200 U.S. service members wounded in Iranian strikes, and then also 13 U.S. service members have lost their lives in strikes in both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, as well as a KC-135 tanker crash that took the lives of 6 U.S. service members.
You know what, John, or Defense Mobile, that was a phenomenal introduction to everything that's going on, and a great summary of the current situation that we're at this current stage of the war. And I think it kind of highlights a significant problem set that we're encountering, right? obviously the United States is in a situation where, with Israel, they're conducting extensive airstrikes instead of Iran. We've already seen a kind of a transition, let's say, from not only the ability of Iran to launch counterstrikes, as you noted, a lot of that has been significantly degraded. Both, the numbers that we're seeing from the GCC countries that have interception has dropped down about, on average, 90%. This is across the board. But I think one of the areas that I would like to kind of expand a little bit with you, John, is this understanding that possibly what we're seeing inside of Iran is that a lot of the IRGC commanders, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of these strikes are happening within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It's happening at the regional commanders and at the tactical level, that they basically received orders prior to this war starting and say, hey, these are the target sets you have. We need to retaliate in this sense. And that's what they're executing outside of the construct of this strategic level, either with the president or, more importantly, with the supreme leader, because it's important to note that after the assassination of Ali Khamenei, the previous supreme leader at the start of this war on 28 February 2026, his son is the one who took over, but there's even reporting that his son might have been injured, and President Trump kind of alluded to maybe even the supreme leader might have been killed, right? At a minimum, it looks like he was injured. And as such, we're seeing Iran conduct retaliatory operations across the region without necessarily a coordination at the strategic level with the president or the supreme leader's office. And I would like to ask you, John, and then, by all means, answer this, and we're going to have Matt and Michael kind of ask you questions or provide their comments. But is this a situation where this was basically what we're seeing as the dead man switch was activated, and the Iranian government is unable to control or manage the regional commanders of the IRGC and the retaliation operations, and it's causing a situation where they're inviting, right now we're seeing the U.S. and Israel obviously conduct more strikes, but we're seeing that Iran is losing the sympathy or the goodwill they might have built with the GCC, because we're seeing the GCC countries, Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, single out Iran. And so is this a situation where we're seeing tactical level response from Iran without strategic guidance, which is now opening an opportunity, however this war ends, that the GCC now are going to look at Iran regardless as the primary enemy, and any goodwill they managed to build within the last couple of years has specifically been shattered. So I'll push that on to you, to John, and then Matt and Michael, please go ahead afterwards. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I think one thing that it is definitely indicative of is the increased influence that the IRGC has right now in the decision-making process. Even in the kind of, for lack of a better term, a triumvirate, this leadership council that's currently, I believe, is the president of Iran and two more hardline clerics. I think he's likely getting outvoted in most times. He's even been openly called out in a very public nature when he released that letter to GCC nations, kind of, for lack of a better term, apologizing to them for their strikes on their oil and gas infrastructure and on civilian infrastructure, and kind of making that promise that it wasn't happen. He then had to very publicly after that walk it back after two other of these decision makers, as these hardline clerics who were part of that council, directly called him out, essentially calling him a weak back guy for making that statement. I think it's a combination of that and exactly what you kind of entailed here, is that disconnect between principal decision makers and operational ones, and this dead man switch kind of has been switched, and people are unable to turn it off, to switch it off here. But I do think that is only true to an extent, because at some point they're going to be able to bridge that communication divide, whether it's somebody literally driving to these bases and telling these guys, hey, stop firing at such and such a target, right? At some point that communications gap is going to be bridged at some point, and we haven't seen that happen yet. We haven't seen that happen yet, or there is a concerted decision by the IRGC, and more importantly, which is essentially Iran now, Iran, to beggar the capabilities, more importantly, the economic capabilities of other GCC nations, to have them pressure the United States to either fall back from this conflict or to maybe claim some level of neutrality status and, not allow U.S. to fly in their airspace or launch attacks from their bases and such on. We've yet to see that. It's only seemed to embolden the resolve of certain nations like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar to continue defensive operations. They've even doubled down and put in a request to buy thousands of Ukrainian counter drone systems, right? And so far, it's only emboldened them. But there is an extent. I do think that there is a cap to that, right? And we saw multiple nations kind of declare force majeure. We've seen a number of other nations, including Saudi Arabia, decrease. I know Saudi Arabia decreased their oil output by at least 12% here. So this is having direct economic effects. That's excluding the whole Strait of Hormuz crisis that's currently ongoing now. We've already seen them decrease their oil exports. We've seen decreased oil output because Iran is directly striking their oil infrastructure.
So John, sorry for jumping in. I guess then the question that I have for you directly then would be, is your assessment that Iran's kind of way of operating right now and their way to prevent regime change, is it this idea that if we go down, the world economy go down? Is that kind of, from your assessment and analysis, is that what Iran is trying to do is cause economic pain for the global economy in the hope that, let's say, the world reaches out to the U.S. and Israel and say, hey, stop these military operations because the global economy cannot sustain? So is this like a hostage situation? And that's the tactic that Iran, or at least elements within the IRGC, are operating under to force the U.S. and Israel to stop the current strike campaign against Iran? Is that kind of what the Iranian tactical and operational strategic goal is right now?
I agree that the strategic goal of Iranian decision makers is essentially to hold the world economy hostage through their actions that we kind of just explained before. But I would say that window for regime change has largely passed, right? And I think Iranian decision makers understand that as well here now, right? Because we haven't seen this cataclysmic collapse of the IRGC and the current Iranian regime. We've seen some level of continuity there. There's reports that, the former Ayatollah's son is in Moscow and other things like this. We've seen other reports that Russia is supporting them with targeting data and things like this, right? So there's other nations that have been invested in the continuity of the Iranian regime here. And largely, I think that window has long passed for that here. And so I think right now, their strategic goal now is to now not only survive the conflict as the current regime is right now, specifically the IRGC's strategic goal here is to survive the conflict by striking and then essentially taking hostage the world's economy. But I do believe, though, that window for regime change has long passed. I think that would have been in the first 5 days of the war, and we just didn't see that.
So I also wonder, in terms of the regime, and I agree with you, I think largely it looks like they're intact, they're still in control, and it's not about to collapse. So is your assessment then, it sounds like what you're saying is to hold the economy hostage, to do, and I think that's evident by a lot of the actions that they're taking, and by prolonging this, we could potentially see them walking away from this, being able to claim some level of victory if that regime stays in place. And part of that is waiting for sort of, second and third order effects to start to come into play, and maybe to see fatigue from some of the countries that are currently supporting the United States.
Yeah, that's exactly what what I'm trying to put down is that they're betting on the fact that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and other nations, including our European partners, will increasingly pressure us to de-escalate here, even as we make plans to escalate and expand our strike campaign alongside Israel here. Now, that being said, I think the big caveat to all of this, especially from American strategic point of view, is that we're seeing kind of increasing diversion between the United States and Israeli decision makers here on what like a possible victory looks like. We've seen Donald Trump even declare victory multiple times in the past couple of days, then kind of go back on his statements, or kind of, say, well, this is going to happen for just the next couple of days and or weeks. Whereas Israeli decision makers and Israeli military thinkers have consistently said like 5 weeks at the least, we're going to be going at this, right? And I think Israeli and U.S. decision makers have different ideas of what they want to get done here. There's something, Stefano, that you've said a number of times, I think, that the more you say it, the more it makes sense to me. And that's there is a serious possibility here that Trump wants to completely destroy Iran's conventional capabilities and then move on and try and conduct that pivot to the Indo-Pacific or wherever else we feel, or that Western hemispheric kind of pivot that we've seen the United States currently conducting, right? And I do think that is also a serious possibility here as well. So it's Iranian decision makers are just playing a waiting game right now here. And as I see it right now, if they can keep this up, right, if they can continue to strike Saudi Arabian, Kuwaiti, Bahraini, and Qatari oil infrastructure and continue to beggar the world economy, they may win. They may win out or be able to tout this as some sort of win without Donald Trump being able to do the same.
I think
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that begs the question, though, from the point of view you just laid out of destroying their conventional capabilities. That's not exactly how they've sold it. Now, there's been a lot of back and forth from the admin in terms of objectives, often conflicting statements about the strategy. And I think that shows that there's sort of a lack of a well thought through plan that was behind this invasion. But when you talk about just trying to destroy the conventional capabilities, part of what was being sold was the concept of going in and, we were doing this because they were so close to developing a nuclear weapon. But if the focus is only on the conventional capabilities, what we risk ending up with, and I would like your take on this, is a Iran that still has some of these, potential goals at achieving a nuclear weapon, but we will have a more opaque Iranian nuclear program. So there hasn't been talk about trying to establish a method of confirming those stockpiles, or is there's a need for inspectors, and is that something that the United States is going to do? So I guess what's your takeaway on that front? If it is true that the United States is just going after conventional arms, which will leave a very much weaker Iran, but does not attack the crux of one of the ways that this war was being sold.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the interesting thing for me here is because we've only seen, for at least in my viewpoint, it's been a limited focus on striking Iranian nuclear facilities. We saw that in the early strikes of the war. And then after a couple of days, we saw B-2 and B-1 bombers launch a fairly heavy targeted strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities and kind of rubbleize them, for lack of a better term. Just today, actually, the Iranian foreign minister was speaking to U.S. news organization saying that their enriched material is under mountains of rubble and there's currently no plan for them to get them. And if they were to make a plan, that they would, quote, have to do it under the supervision of the agency. I'm assuming that he was talking about the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is an interesting point of view. And I didn't really see that get reported on a lot here. Now, it's also important to note that the president and the foreign minister have multiple times said things that has then either gotten called out by some of these more hardline clerics or other IRGC commanders, and then they've either walked these things back or that we've never heard about it again. So that doesn't necessarily actually signal what Iran actually plans to do here. Just from a pragmatic point of view, I don't think we're going to be able to take away their ability to create a nuclear weapon with a standoff strike campaign. The current one that we're conducting here, that would literally require some level of on the ground action, whether that's boots on the ground or, like you mentioned, people on the ground who are supervising the Iranian nuclear program or are creating a lack thereof. But as the current status quo is not going to be able to create that type of win here. And the only way I see, the current administration walking away from this and saying it's a win is if they kind of switch their strategic goals here, publicly switch their strategic goals here and say, well, we only went in to destroy the Iranian military and make sure that they weren't a threat for the next 10, 15, 20 some odd years. Because as it stands right now, we're not going to deter them from creating or trying to create a nuclear weapon and or revamping their nuclear program.
Well, John, to kind of push more into that question, you had said earlier that there clearly right now is a developing difference between the Israeli stated goals and the stated goals of specifically Donald Trump. I mean, gosh, every week it kind of feels like there is a new like achievement or goal of what we're really searching for here. But we're seeing that the president is more and more declaring like, "Oh, we're almost finished. Like our goals are almost complete." Like he looks like that he's trying to achieve some sort of like out into this, while Israeli forces, like you said, are like in saying that they're in this for the long haul. So do you see that like this difference growing between the United States and Israel coming to a head in the future of like really breaking down like the operational, you know, coordination within that we're going to see in the strikes? Do you see Israel potentially even like trying to go out this like themselves or trying to push more action into here? I mean, I remember weeks ago when we had talked about, before the strikes happened, we were all like questioning is like, okay, is the United States even going to want to get involved? Is Israel going to be able to go at this alone? And I think that same question is getting pulled up again now that Trump is wanting to, scale back the operations.
Yeah, I think to some extent we might have already seen that. I know in the past week we saw the Israeli strikes on Iranian oil and gas infrastructure, and they didn't. Well, they warned the U.S. prior, but did not warn them the extent of these strikes. And per reporting, right, U.S. officials, principal U.S. officials, were not happy with those strikes because that was then the impetus for Iran to increase their strikes on Gulf nation oil and gas infrastructure, right? So we may already be beginning to see that divide, but I don't see it getting much bigger than that, right? Because we didn't see that those Israeli strikes didn't create some. We never heard reports that okay, Donald Trump is no longer talking to Bibi Netanyahu. He's no longer talking to they stopped information sharing or intelligence sharing. And from an operational standpoint, I don't see that hurting, and I think they're still going to be able to maintain battlefield communications networks, all these things like that. I think deconfliction will continue the same pace that it's at here. It really depends on the length of the conflict and how long it lasts, right? I think we're going to see the U.S. political will to continue this conflict be exhausted far before the Israeli political will is here. If there's one thing we know about the Trump administration is that they do not like extended conflicts. We saw that with the Houthis. We've already seen that with the Russian negotiations or the multiple rounds of Russia-Ukraine negotiations. We saw that with the Houthis. We saw that with the Gaza negotiations as well. And then their willingness to kind of just let the Israelis, okay, go back to what you were doing before here. And so we're really counting down the time until Donald Trump and the Trump administration kind of essentially, I hate to say it this way, but gets tired of the current situation, declares it a win and walks away.
Can the Trump administration really even walk away, if Iran is still engaging, though? Because if it's engaging, it's going to be still engaging with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, almost everybody in the region, and it's going to be, it's still going to be impacting the global economy. It's still going to, involve the Strait of Hormuz. It's still, going to be an issue for Trump, whether or not the United States is involved as well. So even if he does back out, I'm seeing personally that like you're going to have to try to pull Iran into like, okay, we traded blows, we've done our parts, we can walk away around here, and that raises another like really concerning question whether or not Iran or really even the new leadership that's in place is willing to even consider that. And I'm more of the opinion that I don't think they're going to, and that this is going to become a much larger issue. And Stefano, Matt, I'd like your guys' opinion on that as well.
I mean, I'm genuinely curious how it looks like the US was caught on the back foot when it comes to the mining of the Strait of Hormuz. That's been in like literally every Iranian war game for decades. And so to go into this and now to be appearing to struggle to create this multinational escort coalition, it just again just strikes me of the lack of strategic foresight or thought that was put into the process prior to making such a drastic move, that were the joint strikes with Israel. And it just reminds me again when looking at the way that Trump has treated traditional allies, how the United States under Trump has shown a level of disdain and publicly criticized those allies, and now to be asking for that help, it just again, it just does not show. It's not showing the calculus that should be done before you take these steps.
If I may though, I mean I think one of the interesting aspects of this, if President Trump decides to declare victory, one of the areas that we're not necessarily considering is one of the things that the talking points from the Trump administration right now related to Iran is this idea that their conventional military force has been significantly degraded, right? And I think the Straits of Hormuz, I mean, we kind of joked about, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth or Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. He said, like, well, he basically alluded to it's open. It's just the Iranians who are holding it hostage. But even when we're analyzing the Straits of Hormuz, yes, they've targeted certain tankers that are in the Straits of Hormuz, but the amount of tankers that have actually been targeted, just like an overall, the amount of targets that we're seeing the Iranians respond to, as somebody who's done war games related to Iran, it's significantly less than I would have expected. And I think what we're seeing, the Trump administration's frustration is that, and maybe they're not able to communicate this extensively, is this idea that what we expected the Iranians to do is a lot less than they're able to do. And this idea that the U.S. strikes, the Israeli strikes, are limiting the impact that Iran has, not only to close the Strait of Hormuz, but also cause pain into the Gulf and, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, et cetera, as a whole. It is less than we even expected and anticipated. And I think what the administration is trying to say is maybe they're failing at this, but their argument is we're already demonstrating that we have the initiative. We have the ability to set the standards. And what we're seeing from Iran retaliate against is a lot lower than we would have expected. And that's why you're seeing this messaging from the Trump administration. So, John, my question to you, though, is let's, analyze this from a perspective of we know how Iran, this idea of the strikes from the GCC, the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, et cetera, we know that Iran has always had this baked into their calculus to respond and retaliate against the U.S. But I think what people are not understanding is, and not agreeing with, but where maybe the Trump administration actually has a point, is this idea that it's significantly less and that we're able to deter their military capabilities. And so, John, my question to you is, let's pretend for a second that the Islamic Republic, as it is currently structured, is able to stay in place. The problem they're going to run into is what would prevent the U.S. to Israel, which is the whole key component right now of Iran, why wouldn't they decide to respond again and do this again when all their ballistic missiles, their drone forces, even their naval component to close the Strait of Hormuz has been significantly degraded? Because I think we can all agree, at least, that the Iranian conventional military force, and that includes the IRGC ballistic missile force and their drone forces, have been degraded. It really does look like that Iran is losing a lot of capabilities that if this were to happen again in the next couple of months or next couple of years, they're not able to replicate this as they're trying to do now because of U.S. and Israeli strikes. So, John, I'll push it out to you.
Yeah, it's ironically, as I see it, right? The only thing that would stop the U.S. from repeating that again, it would be the very nations that Iran is currently targeting as we speak here, because they don't want to go through that again. If we were to realize some pause or ceasefire in the conflict, the only thing stopping the United States and/or Israel, well, maybe I'd say keep to the United States at least for the first part of my answer, because Israel has acted unilaterally in the past, and they will again in the future, right? The political will is there to do that. But the only thing stopping the United States, at least, would be nations like Saudi Arabia and nations like Bahrain. nations like Kuwait would put pressure on them, specifically Saudi Arabia more so than others, to not conduct these type of strikes because they don't want to go through that again. There's no way they would be able to harden their oil and gas infrastructure and also the civilian infrastructure for that matter in time. They just don't want to go through this again. And then also there's the global component here, right? European nations would pressure the United States not to do this and to seek other routes. We're kind of already seeing that from nations like France and Italy as well. We've seen Italy kind of reduce the number of their forces here. We've seen Giorgia Meloni, the top decision maker in Italy, kind of be very critical of the ongoing strikes against Iran as well. So pressure from some of the nations who have actually, Iran has even drawn some of their blood here at this point, would actually stop specifically the United States, which may in turn pressure Israel to not conduct it like a second round of strikes if they saw Iran getting to a point where they felt they needed to strike again here. Then there's this other aspect here, which is, something we were eventually going to get to, which is the role of China and then also Russia too. But I want to focus a little bit more on China here. So far, we've seen China unwilling. China does have what they call a flotilla, the 48th anti-piracy flotilla is actually in the region. They're not doing anything as per usual. They did kind of the same thing when the Houthis were firing missiles into the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea. They were actually ignoring maydays from ships as well too. But they're kind of at a standoff range here. They're not doing much here. But the Chinese have sent envoys to Gulf nations and have openly said that they're in direct contact with top decision makers in Iran here too. But other than that, they've been unwilling to beggar the U.S. economy or to beggar the global economy even more, to essentially pressure the United States in more coercive ways to pull back from this campaign. But in the future, there's a possibility that could happen here. I think China understands that the best way I saw it as a fellow analyst, I was talking with them the other day, and they were saying that Donald Trump whether he is doing this intentionally or not, he's punching Xi in the mouth before the meeting. Before they meet with Xi, because a lot of their kind of back end profits when it comes to oil and things like that come from Iran here. I believe somewhere between 15 to 20% of China's oil imports come from Iran. Now, a lot of that goes to things like teapot refineries and things that aren't run by some of the state-sponsored oil companies, but that makes up a good portion of their oil imports. Of their crude imports here. And so in some ways, China is being hurt by this here, and that's why we see the Chinese get directly involved much quicker here. So I think those are some of the aspects, those are some of the factors that will play into deterring the United States and or Israel from kind of just starting this all over again here.
So actually, John, let me jump in quickly though. I think one of the problem sets when we're dealing with Iran is there's three components, right? It's the ballistic missile force with their drones. Number two is the Strait of Hormuz, and number three is their proxy network. But if we're analyzing the proxy network, we're seeing how Israel has been able to basically one by one remove them. And now we're getting reports that Israel is seriously considering, actually not even considering, but it looks like imminent, is going to launch a ground offensive to seize territory south of the Litani River against Hezbollah. We've seen the degradation of the Iranian ballistic missile force. We've seen the degradation of their naval component and all their abilities to close the streets of Hormuz. So if they can focus a little bit more on the Iranian proxy force, it does look like Iran's ability to leverage their proxy networks has been basically deemed combat not effective. The Houthis are not, although it looks like there's some reporting that the Houthis might get involved. I don't think it's going to be anything what we saw during the Israel-Gaza conflict. Hezbollah has been severely degraded. Hamas is non-existent. And so my question to you, John, though, is did Iran lose a target of opportunity with their proxy network and enabled Israel to conduct these strikes against Hamas, against even the Houthis, against Hezbollah, where basically looks like maybe Iran is fighting this on their own, or am I being too optimistic right now? So go ahead, John.
I think one thing, right early on in the conflict, for the first about a week and a half or so, Hezbollah was reticent to get involved here. Now, earlier they did say that should the supreme leader be targeted or killed, that was their threshold for getting involved. And soon after it was confirmed that he was killed, they entered the conflict. So they were actually true to their word, which is pretty interesting to me here. But their response since then has been severely limited to the past exchanges of fire that they've had with the Israelis. We've seen them increasing slowly but surely, but they haven't been able to keep up the tempo that they used to have here. Now, whether that's a capacity or ability thing, like I was discussing before with the Iranians, I'm more so thinking that it's a capacity thing and an ability thing, right? Their stockpiles of weapons have not only been severely reduced, but their stockpiles, quote unquote, of credible decision makers has been severely reduced, right here. And there may not even be political will within Hezbollah to kind of do this for a very long time. We're seeing a reticent Hezbollah, right? It used to be that they would jump to attention when anything relating to Iran or the IRGC was happening throughout the region. We did not see that happen here. They kind of set off these, what at the time seemed like a far off threshold for entering a conflict. I didn't personally expect Khamenei to be killed in the first couple hours of the war. And I don't think not, and I think neither did they, and they assumed that they would not have to get involved as a result of that here. And so now that we see Israel kind of gearing up for another ground operation in southern Lebanon, and we saw their evacuation order was further up, was significantly further north than past evacuation orders have been. Hezbollah may have dug themselves into a hole here by deciding to support their kind of erstwhile benefactor Iran here. And this time Iran's not going to be able to back them up in any way, shape, or form here, outside of maybe, statements and things like that. But Iran's not going to be able to give them the support, whether it's monetary, whether it's economic and or material support that they used to give them in the past here. So Hezbollah may have dug themselves a new grave here, whereas there was previously a possibility that they may somehow ride this out without, in kind of in the same way that the Houthis are as well, without kind of becoming the focus of the Israelis in the United States. And we've now seen them, after targeting Cyprus a number of times and then launching strikes into northern Israel, rocket barrages into northern Israel, they're now becoming the target of not only an increasing a significantly increased airstrike campaign, but also a impending ground campaign as well.
I've thought of this very similar thing when we've come to like consider, everybody involved in the conflict. And, I would agree with that a little bit, John, but I'd also think I think there's a bit to understand to think that like Hezbollah kind of already was very much in one foot in the grave. Like there very much was the possibility they could ride it out, but they like the intensity that Israel was, beginning to mount against Lebanon, including the United States, the pressure on pressure into like try to corral the influence that Hezbollah had, and I think the growing resistance against them, there definitely was the potential that like Hezbollah was just ready to die in the long run. And I definitely don't think that this is going to postpone it in any way, but I think seeing that the type of response the United States and Israel has had to Iran and the type of strikes that are still ongoing, it does call into question like the entirety of Iran's proxy network and like what we're going to see later down the line as far as unconventional warfare, and especially with non-state actors is involved. We've already seen attacks across the globe. We've already seen events happening that are, in response to the United States, and I have said before that I definitely don't think those are going to be the last. I don't think that we're going to see that ceasing in the time especially I think till the end of even to the end of the year. I'd like to just ask everybody too, is like if we are going to see, the United States or anybody else try to dip out of this conflict or try to end it, do you really think that's especially with the new, I'd say increasingly radical leadership we have in Iran now, are we going to see an increase in, these type of attacks, an increase of investment into Iran's proxy network against everybody else?
I mean, I think that cat's out of the bag. So I'm not sure if the United States withdrawing would change that. I think that is something that's probably already in motion. I think the second part of your question with, I'd specifically look at the Houthis and I was trying to point out that while they are, a proxy of Iran in some sense, in a more important sense, they have their own political objectives and goals, and they're not stupid. And so, they're not gonna just go ahead and do something because Iran tells them to. What I think we are likely to see is a pivot in terms of how they're acquiring weapons, their supply chain, probably see them lean more on smuggling. And, we've seen that with, recent indications that, they're working more closely with some of the groups in like Somalia, specifically like Al-Shabaab. I'm sure ISIS, the Islamic State in Somalia is also interested in working with them, and their position gives them access to waterways and to ports. And so we could see a pivot in terms of how they're supporting themselves and seeing them look to other methods of funding and getting what they see they need to meet the needs and those goals and objectives.
Actually, John, let me ask you this. Is it interesting to you that what we're seeing from the proxy networks, the group that is much more involved against targeting American interests, appears to be the pro-Iranian groups in Iraq? In other words, like Kataib Hezbollah, Al-Haq, KSS, the Badr organization. I mean, that construct of the popular mobilization units. Is it interesting to you, John, that they're the ones that appear to be much more interested in targeting American interests compared to, let's say, Hezbollah or even the Houthis, because they have been trying to target American interests in Iraq much more so than any other group? Is that an interesting dynamic? Because we haven't really seen these Iraqi militia groups really being involved until now, when we're comparing Israeli military operations against, Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Is that an interesting dynamic to you, John?
Yes, interesting to me, but not surprising, actually. I think I do agree with Michael, what he said before, that, Hezbollah does have one foot in the grave here. And so in sometimes more ways than even Hezbollah at this point, groups like the PM, Popular Mobilization Front, and other groups that are, nominally subordinate to them, actually have more to lose here, because they've realized a great amount of increased influence by, with, and through Iran as their benefactor, right? And I'm talking as a structural part of the Iraqi government and armed forces, right? And so without that benefactor, the U.S., for lack of a better term, could run riot against them and embolden the regular Iraqi armed forces to kind of curb their influence here. Kind of on the Houthi front, I'm really glad that Matt kind of said what he did about the Houthis, because this is something I've been saying for a long time. In some respects, the Houthis are Iran's greatest success and simultaneously their greatest failure, because the Houthis realize so much influence to the point where they're essentially for a state actor at this point, right? I think we would kind of all agree that the Houthis can essentially be treated as a state actor now, right? They've held the seat of power for a considerable amount of time. They employ a significant amount of conventional and asymmetric capabilities at the same time, and they've deterred a conventional force, that being the Saudis, for a considerable amount of time here. And so the Houthis have realized all this success, all these capabilities, all this influence. They're able to project power outside of their borders, right? This is technically a non-state actor here, right? And so they've kind of, it's kind of like the in Kung Fu Panda, right, where he outgrows the master here, right? We've kind of seen that with the Houthis here. They're no longer really subordinate to the IRGC here, right? Can they give them suggestions and stuff to do this when the Houthis deem it beneficial to themselves to get involved? They've done that in the past. But the Houthis understand, just like Matt said, and just like other people have said in the same way with Hezbollah, right? The Houthis understand that if they get involved here, it's going to draw the ire of the United States and Israel, and or possibly other nations who've been willing to get into coalitions with them here. And so in those respects, I've always seen the Houthis as Iran's biggest success, while simultaneously being their biggest failure here. But on the Iraqi militias, it's not surprising at all, because as I see it, they have the most to lose here, from just a kinetic standpoint and also from an influence standpoint.
No, but John, it's very interesting that it does look, I feel like when people are analyzing, going back to like Iran's military capabilities, one of the things that I find infuriating, at least from my background and my experience, is this idea that what we're seeing in the Straits of Hormuz, how we're seeing Iran retaliate against the GCC countries, again, from my background, it's a lot less than what I would have anticipated Iran from doing. And I think this kind of goes into the talking points of the administration. You can take it for what it's worth. But what the administration is trying to say is we are basically ahead of schedule, right? What we've seen the Trump administration, President Trump specifically say, is that when the United States conducts strikes against Iran, that we are, week 4 from where we would have anticipated in war games, where we would be in a conflict with Iran. And I think people dismiss that. And I think that's not fair, because from my background, doing these type of military war games and military exercises, I would agree with the administration that the Iranian response is significantly less than what I've anticipated where they would be at this time frame. Because again, we're just at the beginning, really, of week 3. We're at the end of week 2. We're about to hit week 3. This recording of this episode is, March 15th, 2026. And, this operation started February 28th, 2026. We're just hitting the 2-week mark overall, and we're about to enter the week 3. I don't understand is there a problem with the administration that they don't know how to message success? Is there a misunderstanding either from the administration's ability to communicate success, or is it that people are impatient with where we're at, and they don't want to deal with the economic consequences of increased gasoline prices, which is exactly what Iran tries to do? Because Iran knows that they can't stop the US and Israel militarily, so they have to approach it from an asymmetric perspective, and which is the price of oil, the price of gasoline. So is there a problem with the administration messaging this? Do you think that there is capabilities that Iran has that they're not leveraging? What do you think the missing link is in this conversation right now for the administration?
Well, I think the missing link is largely the reality of the situation. I think the reality of the situation here is that they're messaging some level of success here, while Iran is still achieving much of the same effects that it was with a higher tempo of strikes, with a lesser tempo, with a significantly reduced tempo of strikes. Whether or not that's a willing decision by them to reduce strikes, or because they simply cannot keep that tempo of strikes due to the saturation of U.S. and Israeli strikes, they're still achieving the same effects: higher gas prices, reduced oil output, and reduced trade through the Strait of Hormuz, right? And going back to the Houthis a bit, right? One thing that the Iranians did gain from the Houthis was the conflict in the Bab el-Mandeb and the surrounding maritime areas was essentially a litmus test for how they were going to hold hostage the Strait of Hormuz here, right? They saw that the Houthis sometimes launched only 1 missile a day, but insurance was still up and or canceled, and even with escort coalitions, trade through that strait was significantly reduced. And so the Iranians saw that and said, we don't even really have to saturate the Strait of Hormuz with a bunch of fires. We got to fire off, hit a couple of ships once, kill a couple of people, kill a couple of mariners, right? And we'll send the message enough. And it's essentially working, at least as I assess it. They're achieving much of the same effects that they were at the outset of the war here. And so that's why I think the administration is having so much trouble kind of signaling success here, because as I see it, we're not really having success here, because even though we've significantly degraded their conventional capabilities and some of their asymmetric capabilities, right, they're still able to achieve the same effects with reduced fire output.
And if I could just add, in terms of the messaging, it was more or less non-existent prior to the war. And if we look at, prior to Afghanistan or prior to Iraq, there was a national conversation, and there were stated goals. And what we've seen is a level of schizophrenia when talking about what the United States is trying to achieve. And so if the American people cannot define what success looks like, then using, the gains, which have been significant. And, I said this even last week that the opening salvo spoke to the power of American and Israeli intelligence and military capabilities, but without having these clear defined goals and having many of the original, stated goals now taken off the table, talking about the Iranian people rising up, or getting rid of the regime, or, they're even talking about trying to establish, someone like Dulce Rodriguez, like they did in Venezuela, to me just pointed to a misunderstanding of what was achievable here. And then it pair that with all of the sort of like effects that this is having in terms of, like our true strategic adversaries like China and Russia benefiting from this in various ways, while the United States is also depleting, stockpiles of interceptors and spending a lot of money. And I think that is where there is a disconnect.
I'd absolutely agree with that as well. And I think the big thing that is missing, especially within the United States, is like the political baggage that is also coming with this war. Matt, you're absolutely right. There was not the buildup of, you could call it propaganda. There was not the buildup of justification that was coming with this war. And I think because of that, and honestly, truly the political baggage that Donald Trump carries is that there's always going to be a big part of the population that is going to be unresponsive to him, that is going to be unresponsive to his actions. And I also think we got to carry on as well is that there's a big growing part of the population, Republicans and Democrats, that are growing very unresponsive to anything that's going to involve Israel, especially including in war. And having this, having all of these things involved inside of the war, I think even as successful the United States could be, even if like say we got everything we wanted in like the first couple of days, even if we saw regime change, we'd still see similar pushback. And now that we're at this point right here where we don't have regime change, we're seeing an increase in gas prices, we're seeing continued strikes on our allies. We're seeing, various different, claims of accomplishment, claims of, however the conflict is going to continue on. The lack of messaging is definitely not carrying on, or definitely not helping with, trying to sell any kind of success. And, success, was already a very narrow window to hit, and I think it's been completely missed.
And I think I would also add to that is a lot of Americans lived through the war on terror. Americans know what mission creep looks like, objective drift. They're more familiar with those terms than they probably were prior to uh, the Iraq War. And so that is a big concern for a lot of the American people, especially when you have one of these stated goals is taking out the nuclear program, which they said they'd already destroyed. And the realization that to do that effectively would mean that they would need to have, boots on the ground. And, that is the term that is being tossed around and that resonates with a lot of Americans. And I don't think they want to see that. And so if unless they tackle those aspects of the messaging, then I think we're going to continue to see high levels of doubt in the American people.
But okay, you can make the argument that the American people are going to have doubts. I don't disagree with that. But I made this argument in a space, which is if you're President Trump, the elections are in November. The change of Congress is January of 2027. So that means you have all the way up to January of 2027 from a military perspective to institute change on the ground. And frankly put, the Iranians, I don't think can sustain this. In the sense that from an economic perspective, we've already seen the problem that the Iranian economy has. You're now adding this, a significant amount of military campaign against them. The Israelis in the US are already changing their military strategy to target elements that are responsible for the internal security of Iran, the police force, the Basij, the IRGC ground forces, etc. So the question then becomes, you can make the argument that, the U.S. has elections and that matters, etc. But if you're Iran, you are banking your strategy up to January of 2027. Because if Trump loses in November, he doesn't care unless you can impact significantly the world economy, that the world gets at you to stop this military campaign. But then the question is, what is your military capability from Iran when this conflict ends? And their ballistic missile forces have been degraded. Their proxy networks are basically gutted. And their ability to legitimately close the Strait of Hormuz is null. And there's even an argument to make how much of Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz is an actual military capability rather than, hate to use this term, vibes. And I feel like there is a overreaction in the international oil markets and the international maritime markets on the ability of the Iranians to really target and shut down the Straits of Hormuz than what it really is. Because in the end of the day, yes, the Iranians have targeted a certain amount of tankers, specifically west of the Straits of Hormuz, closer to Iraq. But they haven't really been able militarily, if you're going to analyze this like legitimately from a military perspective, to actually close the Strait of Hormuz. Which is a whole different conversation, by the way, of this idea what the Trump administration is arguing, which is this is why we need to go now, because we've already seen Iran try to close the Strait of Hormuz and hold the world economy at hostage, as kind of reinforcing their talking points of like, this is why we can't have Iran continue this operation. But I feel like militarily, Iran has not been able to meet where they should be, and they're leveraging the panic that their actions are causing rather than their actual capabilities to do it. But Michael, I see your hand up. I'll go to you and then we can go to John. Go ahead, Michael.
I mean, I don't disagree with you, Stefano. Like, there is fundamentally, you can argue, yes, in the long run, the United States very much has the advantage. The United States can, specifically President Trump can leverage a victory out of here in the long run and can get the accomplishment that he wants. But I think just the consequence is that like everybody lives in the short term. That's where we are. And the vibes honestly impact a lot more than I think think about our day to day, especially in terms of the economy, especially when right now people are already feeling, very contentious about how the economy is going to be, feeling very worried about everything else. And I don't think that like there is various other things, other, pardon me, there's various other vibes, I guess I'll use the term, that are also impacting that as well. And even if we just focused on like the military capability, if we just focused on like to January of next year, I don't think that like there is enough. I don't think that there's enough for the Trump administration to properly argue that, for people, especially when there's already a bunch of grievances for them already. But that's just my opinion, and that's where like I do think that like that's where the struggle for the Trump administration comes from, even if they may have the capability.
John, please, I love your intake. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think analyzing like you said from a military or intelligence perspective, I think if we look at the indicators here, right? We've already seen the U.S. begin to marshal ground forces to the region, right? And marshal additional capabilities, specifically an amphibious ready group, and then the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit over there. And there's also been reports of additional forces, but none of those have been confirmed as of yet, right? But that does indicate that what the Trump administration is going after here is some level of regime change and or securing their enriched material, which I think one cannot happen without the other, right? So we're kind of going for regime change here. How much of that is led by the, not saying Israeli lobby here, but by the Israelis, decision makers, kind of how much they have a say in kind of the decision-making process here from an operational standpoint here. But regime change does seem to be one of the goals here, if not the primary goal here. One thing I did want to touch on, though, is earlier we were talking about kind of the lack of a plan B, plan C, and a plan, so on all the way to Z, whatever, right? But I don't think that there was no second, or third plans that they were made. I think, contingency plans were definitely made. I wouldn't denigrate kind of the planning and the policy arms of the Department of War here by any means here. But one thing I do think there has been, though, I think a reticence by the Trump administration and other top decision makers in the administration and also in the Department of War to pivot to some of these secondary or tertiary plans here that they have in the making here. And I think that's why we're seeing, I was talking on the Brody's Analyze Educate podcast earlier today, and he was saying, he was rightly saying that, if we were going to deploy a Marine Expeditionary Unit here, this should have already happened before the opening shots of the war. This should have already been in the region. We shouldn't have to be pivoting that, repositioning that from the Indo-Pacific to here now, right? And that's what I think, that's why, and I think that's indicative of kind of this reticence to kind of move to some of these backup plans here. And now they're sort of slowly starting to do it here. And so that's why I think, from just intelligence, standpoint here, it is indicating that the Trump administration, at least for now, is going for regime change. Now, that could change tonight, tomorrow, or in a week or 2 weeks to 5 weeks. Who knows? But that remains to be seen.
And I also think at the end of the day, the question needs to be asked is, do the American people feel that we needed to take this action? Do they believe that there was an imminent threat? And without that, and I don't believe that was the case. Without that, then it's hard to sell a victory that no one was asking for, especially when so much money is being spent on it. And there are other concerns at home when we have, a Congress and Senate that aren't being effective. They're not passing bills. We're not seeing the things that people really care about. When you already had a lot of these questions around affordability and was struggling to, the Trump administration was struggling to combat that narrative, then seeing the price of gas goes up becomes, again, if we're talking about short-term thinking, like that is something that hits people immediately and that they feel, and they can draw a straight line to this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you there. I think we're going to increasingly see the political will decrease for this war, as we not only continue to expend more munitions and money as well, but also lives. If God forbid that we take more casualties and fatalities in this war.
No, I think one of the key aspects of this is I do believe it's very funny because President Trump, literally while we're doing this recording, released a Truth Social post kind of highlighting Iran's ability to manipulate public perception and how they're using the media to kind of push their narrative, et cetera. And I think that's a fundamental problem in 2026 compared to if we were going to do this, let's say, in 1996, right? This is where the access of information, the interconnectivity of social media and how the news is being pushed, where all of us, in many aspects, have become much more prevalent and much more relevant, is because of social media, is actually hindering the United States. Because they're able, Iran specifically, to push specific narratives to try to achieve mission success, regardless of its reality. Because we're talking about a situation where the U.S. is able to completely degrade and destroy a country ability to really sustain themselves as a regional power with, at tops, KIA 13, individuals, 6 of which was not related to hostile forces. It was a KC-135 that had an aircraft incident, an accident, and it was not from hostile forces. But they're able to leverage that to try to see if they can push the American people to end this war. And it's very interesting that I think that the American people, because of the access and the information we have now compared to 20, 30, 40 years ago, the Iranians might be in an advantage here because they're able to push information. They're able to push messaging that benefits them either from a casualty perspective, from an economic perspective, specifically to the Straits of Hormuz. because reality dictates that if you're analyzing this in the Straits of Hormuz, which has seen periods of tensions and closures, specifically like the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, it's significantly less than what we're seeing now. The amount of mines that the Iranians have laid right now, based on all the reporting we got, it's pennies on the dollar. It's nothing compared to what they did in the 1980s. And yet it appears to have a significant more impact than in the 1980s, which was the greatest threat. And I think that's what the Iranians are trying to leverage. And I think the Iranians are trying to leverage social media specifically to push the narrative to have a great amount of perception of success than there really are. But, John, I think that also falls, although, in this idea of information warfare, where information warfare is a key tenet of modern, combat operations, and the Iranians are going to use it to their maximum capabilities, even though all the other aspects, maybe they have failed.
Yeah, I 100% agree here. I think the Iranians, in kind of some of the same ways like the Chinese have been, already are, and then how they might do in a future conflict with the United States, have been really great at kind of penetrating the American information space with massive amounts of disinformation and misinformation, and people are eating it up. I mean, we see how it is on the X app, right? We see how it is on X, kind of the way that many of these people kind of just eat everything up, and they'll ask Grok to kind of confirm things instead of looking it up themselves or doing their own due diligence. And then that in and of itself will lead the information space, and that will lead the discussion on the certain topic, right? I mean, how many times has Iran said that they sank the Abraham Lincoln, or how many times has the Houthis, or how many times has Iran said that they sank the Ford carrier, or sank a ship in the Ford carrier strike group? People don't even notice that the Iranians have said that like 11 times since the conflict started, but they eat it up each time, And I think there's kind of this one thing that disinformation and misinformation takes advantage of is a serious, gap in knowledge that everyday people have when it comes to geopolitics, military, and defense and security matters, right? And we're seeing that actively at play here.
I think that is a great place to sort of put a pin in this. This is obviously still developing, very fluid. So we're going to be continue to watch this. John, Defense Bulletin, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have you back sooner this time, and we'll continue to watch this, and we'll have another conversation with you in the near future. Thank you so much. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front on Artorias podcast, and we will talk to you soon.